We've talked a lot about the coaching search for the Jets. We've talked a lot about the GM search for the Jets. We've talked a lot about the quarterback decision for the Jets. But this team also has a number of critical decisions to make at the offensive skill positions this offseason. Let's break them down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 3rd, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Terms and conditions apply. Well, it feels like we've gotten through the first phase of the offseason for the New York Jets. We now have a general manager in place. We have a head coach in place, and the critical coaching staff positions have been filled. So now we can begin to look to the rest of the offseason. Of course, decision number one will come at the quarterback spot. Will Aaron Rodgers return? But once you get past the quarterback, there are some other really important things the Jets need to do on the offensive side of the ball this offseason. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's show. Now, the Jets wide receiver position is likely to see a lot of action this offseason. For me, priority number one is getting Garrett Wilson extended long-term. Garrett Wilson is now through his third NFL season. And the rules of the league state that after you are finished with your third season, you are allowed to sign a long-term contract extension. And for the New York Jets, I think that needs to be priority number one. First of all, because Garrett Wilson has proven himself to be an outstanding player. But second, there are a lot of rumblings that Garrett Wilson maybe isn't happy. Of course, these things can change quickly. A player can go from unhappy to very happy like that. All it takes sometimes is a big money contract extension. And for the Jets, I think it goes beyond Garrett Wilson's production on the field. I think right now this organization's reputation is about as low as an NFL team's reputation can get. And it will not be an easy task to turn that around. It does not happen overnight. It cannot happen in one move, but you need to begin somewhere. And I think the first step is getting a guy like this, a guy who has been a 1,000-yard receiver in a bad situation for 3 years, a guy who there has been rumblings around that he isn't happy. If you can get him to commit to this franchise, that's the first thing you need to do. That is step number one. So I think that's the number one thing the Jets need to do. And beyond that, it's important because once you get past Garrett Wilson, the Jets are going to have a lot of question marks at the wide receiver position because I don't think there's any way around this. Their number 2 and number 3 receivers cannot come back in 2025. Their number 2 and number 3 receivers are Davante Adams and Allen Lazard. And the reasons these guys cannot come back are very different. For Lazard, it's just he has not proven himself to be a very good or reliable player. Adams did during his 3/4 of a season in New York, but Adams just comes with too big of a price tag. And you have to set up the Jets offseason by looking at their salary cap situation. So currently, the great cap site overthecap.com, which is the number one place you can get salary cap information on the Jets or any other team, they project that the Jets will have about $20.9 million in cap space. So we'll round up. We'll say $21 million. And that's an estimate. Sometimes the cap ends up being a little bit bigger than the projections this time of year. Jets may end up with a little bit more. But you look at the state of this roster right now. The Jets, first of all, either need to upgrade or re-sign their starter at just about half of the spots on the roster. About half of the starters either need to be upgraded or re-signed. And $21 million is not a lot of money. A decent free agent can take up a loan can take up a big chunk of that, and that does not even include the cap space you need to sign your draft class, to sign your practice squad, to have some money in reserve for the season. And the only 2 players the Jets can cut this offseason who would create at least $5 million of cap space are Davante Adams and Allen Lazard. Lazard would create about $6.6 million in cap space. Adams would create just under $30 million in cap space. So that's a huge number. And the thing is, we know Davante Adams can still play because he was still productive with the Jets this past season. He was especially productive in the role the Jets had him in, which was essentially the number 2 receiver. Now, he may have gotten number one targets, but he was really the second best receiver on the team. The Jets put him in the slot an awful lot, which essentially allowed him to feast on easier matchups because other defenses were really focused on shutting Garrett Wilson down. It's ironic because when the Jets traded for Adams, the theory was that, well, he'll draw all the tough assignments, Garrett Wilson will feast. And ended up kind of being the opposite, where Garrett Wilson really was the guy who drew the tough assignments, and Adams ended up benefiting as a result. We saw that Adams could still play. And I think that for Davante Adams' next team, it would be wise to stick him in the slot extensively, kind of what the Cardinals did with Larry Fitzgerald late in his career. And I don't think Adams is going to add the run blocking that Larry Fitzgerald did, but he's a smart receiver. He runs routes really well. He can take advantage of slot corners who typically aren't as high level of a player as you have on the outside. He'll do very well with some team out of the slot. What you can't have if you're the Jets is a 32-year-old receiver, a guy who still a very good player, but clearly, not quite on the level he was at Green Bay. You can't have him with a $38.25 million cap hit. It just doesn't work. It's just too much money for the Jets cap situation when you've got so many holes to fill. You won't be able to fill all of your holes, but to fill as many of your holes as possible, you can't keep Adams. And that doesn't even go into the guys who need contract extensions, one of whom we just mentioned, Garrett Wilson. There's just no way to make it work. This was an ill-advised trade. And the reason it's an ill-advised trade is that it did nothing for the team, even though the player held up his end of the bargain. Because Davante Adams was about as good as you could have hoped for at this point of his career. He wasn't quite the guy he was in Green Bay when he was making the first team All-Pro multiple times. But he was still a very, very effective receiver, a guy who occasionally could take a game, as he did against Jacksonville, win against the Jaguars. But the Jets handled the trade very poorly. And first, they never should have made it because they were 2-4 at the time, and there was really no way a wide receiver was going to save their season. And that's not a second guess; it's what I said at the time. If you want to go back, but they didn't redo his contract. They gave up a third-round pick, and they didn't give themselves any leverage in the contract negotiations. They left the contract as it was, which essentially gives Adams full authority because Adams knows the Jets can't bring him back at $38 million. So he has all the say now. If he doesn't want to come back, and I don't think he'll want to come back if Aaron Rodgers isn't here, you can just tell him, I'm not redoing my deal. You can cut me and I'll go somewhere else. And he'll go somewhere else and probably play well and probably help another team. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the Jets are just not a contender. I think they thought they were contenders at the point they traded for him, but they really weren't. So this is a guy who, if he had gone to a legitimate top team in the AFC, may have potentially swung the conference to a different team. But for the Jets, he's a 32-year-old. By the time the Jets are, going to be hopefully contenders, Adams probably isn't going to be very helpful going forward. I think the best case scenario would be if the Jets figured out a way to talk him into working out, being able to speak with every other team, picking his location, and then maybe working out a trade for like a late round pick or something like that, and at least recoup some value in return. But Adams can't really come back. And if Adams can't come back, Alan Lazard certainly can't come back. That contract was a mistake. The day the Jets signed it, that was just a case of the Jets mistakenly thinking Aaron Rodgers was all that they needed, and they could just do whatever Aaron Rodgers asked them to do. And Alan Lazard got paid. Alan Lazard got life-changing money out of that situation. But we've seen in the last 2 years that he's not a guy you want to pay any amount of money to. And again, with a situation where you're tight up against the cap, and you have so many things you need to do this offseason, a $6.6 million cap savings, that's just something you have to do. I don't even think that one's negotiable. I think I'm going to get some pushback on when I say Davante Adams can't come back. I don't think I'm getting any pushback by saying Alan Lazard can't come back because he simply can't. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's turn our attention to the backfield. Jets have to figure out what's going on there. They need to figure out how good the guys are in the backfield really are. Let's break it down as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. Here's how it works. You post your job. LinkedIn's new feature can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high-quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about some big decisions the Jets need to make at their skill positions this offseason. We focused a lot on the GM search, on the coaching search. We've talked a lot about what they need to do at the quarterback position, but we also need to talk about whoever the quarterback is, what his supporting cast is going to look like at the key spots on offense. And let's move on now to the running back position. Now, running back, it was kind of an odd year for the Jets where things were all sorts of up and down. I think by any measure, Breece Hall's season, it was a tad disappointing from the standpoint that I think, especially after a 2023 season where the Jets could not run block at all, and Breece Hall still was regularly producing big plays and still almost ended up with 1,000 rushing yards. You were looking for him to make a big step. You were looking for him to maybe become like a top 5 back. And that did not happen. And I think first impressions can be a big deal because I think part of the reason people are down on Breece Hall is that his season got off to a terrible start. His first 5 games were bad, including a game against Denver when the Jets lost 10-9 on September 29th, week 4, where he rushed 10 times for 4 yards, an average of 0.4 yards per carry. But 2 weeks later, Hall started to pick things up. He had a big game against the Buffalo Bills on Monday night, a game the Jets did lose. But from that point forward, from the Buffalo game, over his final 11 contests, Hall averaged 4.7 yards per carry. He had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage alone in those games, and he averaged over 90 yards from scrimmage in all of those games. So Breece Hall kind of picked it up near the end. Now, I think part of this is the Jets need to understand how to use him a little bit better. We know he can be a weapon out of the passing game. We know, if he gets the ball in space, he can break big plays. But going a little deeper than that, I really think I've come to feel like the issue with Breece Hall is not that he's quote unquote patient, because that's the issue people have with him. People say he waits too long to make his cuts. I don't think it's so much he's patient like Le'Veon Bell was. I just think he's not reading blocks is not really his forte. And that means I think Tanner Engstrand, the new offensive coordinator, should really focus on more gap runs with Breece Hall. And the reason I say that is there are essentially like 2 kinds of run plays. There's what are known as gap plays and what are known as zone blocking plays. And there are some other ones. There's this one called duo, which I guess doesn't really fit neatly into either category. But the reason I think that the Jets should focus more on gap runs with Breece Hall is that gap runs typically have a designed hole where the ball's supposed to go. So there's less dancing for the running back. There's less decision-making, whereas zone plays tend to be longer developing plays where the running back kind of like has to read his blocks. He has to anticipate and pick his holes. I think Breece is much better as just a downhill guy where you take the decision-making out of his hands. Now, it's not quite that simple. What I said was an oversimplification because if you run a gap play and the hole isn't there, the running back has to find a different hole to get through. But there's usually less hesitation involved. And I think those are the plays where Breece Hall can do more damage. I don't know that he's ever going to be the great back. I don't know that he's ever going to be what Saquon Barkley was this year for the Philadelphia Eagles, but he's still a quality player. And I think, as you look to the offseason, he's another guy who is now eligible for a contract extension. And with Hall, the situation is a little bit different than it is with Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner or even Jermaine Johnson. And that's because Hall was a second-round pick. And as the first-round picks from the class of 2022, the 3 guys they named, Wilson, Gardner, and Johnson, the Jets have a team option for those players' 5th year. So the Jets can pick up a team option on any of those 3, and those players will be under contract for 2026. As a second-round pick, Breece Hall does not have a 5th-year option. Now, what does that mean? It means that it would be better if the Jets were able to figure something out with him this offseason. Now, the top of the market contract is Christian McCaffrey, $19 million. Then Jonathan Taylor's making $14 million a year. Maybe a better point of reference would be Saquon Barkley, $12.5 million this year. I don't see how Breece Hall gets that amount of money. I don't see how Breece Hall asks for that amount of money. If he wants that amount of money, then you have to look at it. Then there's really nothing you can do. I think this year has shown us that we've gone too far in devaluing running back second contracts. There used to be the saying, the running back position has been devalued. You should never give a running back a second contract. Well, look at Saquon Barkley, look at Derrick Henry, look at Josh Jacobs, guys who have succeeded, veteran backs who have been in the league a while, who got fairly big money deals this offseason and were able to succeed. I don't think Breece is quite on their level. I think that, if we're talking maybe, I don't know, if Breece was amenable to maybe like a $7 million a year long-term deal, I think that's something you would look at, especially because his odometer is not super high. So I think like you always set a price, especially for running back, you do set a price. But I think you try and get him under contract in the long run because look, Breece Hall may not be as good as we wanted him to be, but you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. I think Breece Hall is part of the solution. And then behind Breece Hall, you had two rookies who had kind of interesting seasons. You had Braylon Allen, who I was really excited about the first like 5 weeks or so because he got off to a great start this season. And then after the calendar turned to October, his production just like fell off a cliff. I mean, he was effective in short yardage situations, but after October 1st, he literally had one game where he averaged more than 4 yards per carry. And more often than not, he was under 3 yards per carry. I mean, his production just went nowhere. So it's kind of funny because that kind of resembles what his college career was like in Wisconsin, where he had a fantastic first year, and then years 2 and 3 were a little mediocre. You'd like to see Braylon Allen become a player. I really thought the Jets had something on their hands early in the season with Allen, especially that Tennessee game where he scored a couple touchdowns. Looked like a player, like a guy who showed he could make plays out of the backfield as a receiver. But then late in the season, the second back the Jets drafted late in the 2024 draft started to get a chance. It was Isaiah Davis, and it was a limited chance. You saw him quite a bit on kickoff returns where I guess he was okay. But late in the season, the Jets gave him some opportunities to run the football and limited sample size, only 30 rushing attempts, but did get 174 yards in those. So that's almost a 6-yard average. Now, of course, if you increase Davis's number of carries, that's going to go down. Nobody can average 6 yards per carry over the long haul, but he runs hard. And we know the running back position, one of the reasons it was devalued, maybe we've devalued it too much. But one of the reasons it was devalued is relative to other positions, it is a bit easier to find a back on day 3 of the draft who can play than it is, almost anywhere else. So I think it's plausible Isaiah Davis could be a player. So I think when you look at this offseason, the objectives are really, first of all, focusing on the film on what Breece Hall does well and building a running scheme around that. I think more gap runs would be a good move for the Jets. I think getting Breece Hall under contract long term, if he's willing to take an affordable deal. There seems to be this perception in the fan base that he's going to want top of the league money, which I don't really understand entirely because it's not like he's performed at that level. And then figuring out, between Allen and Davis, who's going to be your number 2 back going forward, and very well maybe something you decide in training camp next year. Now, head to here on the Locked On Jets podcast. There's one more skill position to discuss. And it's a position where the Jets really only have one viable player, and that player is about to hit free agency. What should the Jets do at tight end? We'll discuss continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. And here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections. If you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL, for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Game Time. Looking for tickets to the next big event? Maybe last-minute tickets to the big game next week? Whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sports game, finding the right ticket at the right place can be a headache. But with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. With Game Time Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. I've used Game Time on a number of occasions myself. I don't just tell you about Game Time. I use it to buy tickets. I've gone to the U.S. Open tennis. I've gone to football games. I've gone to see a couple of things on Broadway. Every single time I've gotten a great deal at the last minute. What I like is they give you the view from your seat. They give you a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so no surprises when you arrive. I also like they're all in pricing. No hidden fees. Sometimes you buy a ticket and the price isn't what they say it'll be. There's some hidden fees when you check out. Not on Game Time. Game Time, all in pricing. You know exactly what you're going to pay before you buy. Ready to make your next event even better? Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about the skill positions for the New York Jets this offseason. I think there are some solutions for the Jets at wide receiver, especially locking Garrett Wilson up long term. Jets have some interesting players at the running back position, but tight ends is going to be a challenging spot for the Jets this offseason because there's really only one viable tight end on the roster, and that's Tyler Conklin. And he's about to hit free agency. And I don't know that the Jets are going to be able to keep him because if you look at the list of tight end free agents, it's not a very talented group. I mean, there's a case to be made that Tyler Conklin this offseason will be the top free agent available on the market. And that creates a challenging situation for the Jets because, as we talked about, they have a pretty tight cap situation. That's even if they get rid of Davante Adams. But beyond that, even if we get past their cap situation, there's a lot of other priorities. There's a lot of spots that need upgrades. Again, they got to figure out this class of 2022. There's some guys from the class of 2021. Jamie Sherwood's hitting free agency. Elijah Vera Tucker is on the verge of hitting free agency in another year. Priorities come into play. And that's simply because most tight ends don't really make that big of a difference. Now, if you have a guy who's a legitimate mismatch, then, if you have one of those guys who has like receiver skill sets in the linebacker's body, that's a guy that's really tough to beat. But most tight ends are just kind of interchangeable. I think the difference between like the 7th best tight end and the 30th best tight end in the league really isn't that great. If you look to Conklin, I mean, what he's done with the Jets, I mean, I think you would say like his first month with the Jets was a disaster. I remember after his first month, I said that, it made me miss Ryan Griffin because he just got off to such a terrible start with the team. But then kind of bounced back after that and gave them functional play. I mean, he didn't do anything special. He was never a great blocker. Wasn't really a guy who could stretch the field or get down the seam. Occasionally, maybe once a month, he'd make a contested catch or drag guys down the field. His production, there were some empty calories in there. He'd catch a lot of passes in garbage time of blowouts, checkdowns, or checkdowns on third down where you get tackled short of the sticks. But relative to other tight ends, I don't know he was much worse or much better than most of the tight ends in the league. The challenge for the Jets is that once you get past him, you're dealing with Jeremy Ruckert. It can be tough to explain because we saw Ruckert in college, and while he wasn't the most productive player at Ohio State, I mean, he could do basic things. He could catch the ball. He could throw a block. If for whatever reasons, sometimes it just gets into your head once you're in the NFL and things just snowball on you. I mean, I think Ruckert was a better player in college than he was in the pros. And, look, it's always possible. A new coaching staff means a fresh start. Maybe he can refocus. Maybe he can find something. But it's really tough to bet on Ruckert right now. And it's even tougher to say he's starting level material in this league. But it's tough because, again, Conklin is going to be a guy who's probably going to get a decent contract this offseason. But for where the Jets are, I don't know if the Jets can really afford to pay Conklin. And after you get past him, I mean, what direction do you go in? I mean, do you want to go with Zach Ertz, who's in his mid-30s? I mean, do you want to go Austin Hooper, who's just an okay guy? Do you want to go with Mike Gesicki from Cincinnati? There really aren't a lot of options out there. And I mean, I think if the Jets were going to go with Mercedes Lewis, it would have happened when Aaron Rodgers was here. And I think the Jets wisely stayed away from Mercedes Lewis, one of the few wise things the Jets have done the last couple of years. This is going to be the type of thing that tests Darren Muji and Aaron Glenn and the new coaching staff, because I think what the Jets really need to do is they need to find some guy who's like kind of a diamond in the rough somewhere, or somebody who maybe didn't get much of a chance in his first stop, somebody who's like maybe in his mid-20s who's kind of off the radar. But this is easier said than done. The tight end position, again, I guess the silver line is the tight end position is not that important unless you have like one of those top guys. But it's kind of a hole for the Jets right now. And the Jets are probably going to lose Conklin. And the Jets probably should have traded Conklin at the deadline. I mean, I think there were a lot of mistakes made by the New York Jets this season. And one of them was the way they handled the trade deadline, which when the team was hopelessly out of the race, they held on to the veterans instead of trading them and getting something in return. Jets at least could have a draft pick now in addition to the hole they have at tight end. But a challenging position for the New York Jets as they move forward. And if we're looking at the teams, it doesn't always mean just because you have a coaching staff that's from Detroit doesn't always mean you're going to respond to things the way Detroit did. But the Lions did draft Sam Laporta in the second round. So maybe that's the model. Maybe the Lions coaches who have come over here see that as maybe there are some prospects the Jets will be looking at round two through 4 range to help fill that spot. But there are no easy answers at tight end. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.